The Yakima River cut through downtown like a frozen blade, its December waters black as midnight. Sarah Chen was 8 months pregnant and just trying to get to her doctor's appointment when she heard the screams. A man had fallen through the ice near the old bridge. The current was dragging him under fast. Without thinking, she kicked off her boots and jumped. The shock of the water hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending electric jolts through her swollen belly. Her baby kicked violently in protest, but Sarah pushed forward through the churning current. The man's head bobbed up and down, his dark hair plastered against his skull as he fought to stay conscious. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the rush of water. "I'm coming!" Detective Marcus Williams felt his strength ebbing with each passing second. The ice had given way beneath him so suddenly that he'd barely had time to call out before the river claimed him. Now, as hypothermia crept through his limbs, he watched in disbelief as a heavily pregnant woman struggled toward him through the deadly current. "No," he tried to yell, but only managed a weak croak. "Too dangerous." Sarah reached him just as his eyes began to roll back. She hooked her arm under his chin, using a technique she'd learned in the lifeguard training she'd taken years ago, back when she was still Emma Williams, before she'd learned to hide, before she'd learned to run. The irony wasn't lost on her now, fighting to save a stranger while her own past threatened to drown her daily. The current pulled at them both, and Sarah felt her energy draining fast. Her coat weighed her down like an anchor, but she couldn't risk letting go of Marcus long enough to shed it. She kicked toward the riverbank, her movements growing sluggish as the cold seeped into her bones. Marcus's vision blurred, but through the haze he caught sight of the woman's face. Even with her lips blue from cold and her features contorted with effort, there was something achingly familiar about her. The shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, it reminded him of someone he'd spent half his life searching for. "Emma," he whispered, the name escaping his lips before conscious thought could stop it. Sarah's blood turned to ice that had nothing to do with the river. She nearly lost her grip on him, shock making her limbs go weak. No one had called her that name in 15 years. No one knew that name here. Desperation gave her a final burst of strength. She pulled Marcus toward a section of bank where the current had carved out a small eddy. Her feet found purchase on the rocky bottom, and she hauled him into the shallows just as her legs gave out completely. They collapsed together on the frozen shore, both gasping and shivering violently. Sarah's hands instinctively moved to her belly, checking for any sign that her baby had been harmed by their ordeal. The steady movement beneath her ribs brought a sob of relief. Marcus rolled onto his side, coughing up river water, his training as a detective warring with his desperate hope. He forced himself to focus on the woman who'd saved his life. She was pulling off her soaked coat with trembling hands, and that's when he saw it. A small, crescent-shaped birthmark on the inside of her left wrist, the same mark he'd traced with his finger in faded foster care photos for 20 years. "Emma?" His voice was stronger now, urgent. "Emma Williams?" Sarah's whole body went rigid. She scrambled backward, putting distance between them even as her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Sarah Chen." But Marcus had seen the recognition flicker across her face, the moment of pure terror before she'd schooled her features. He struggled to sit up, his detective instincts overriding his physical discomfort. "You have a scar," he said quietly, nodding toward her wrist, "shaped like a crescent moon. You got it when you fell off your bike trying to follow me to school. You were 5. Sarah's breath caught. The memory was so vivid it might have happened yesterday. Pumping her little legs as hard as she could, determined to keep up with her big brother, the scrape of gravel against her skin when the bike toppled over. "Marcus?" The name came out as barely a whisper. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Someone had called 911, and emergency vehicles were racing toward the bridge. Sarah's expression shifted from wonder to panic in an instant. "I have to go," she said, struggling to her feet. "Emma, wait. You don't understand." She was backing away now, her whole body language screaming flight. "I can't be found. There are people—" The ambulance rounded the corner, its lights flashing red and blue against the grey December sky. Sarah cast one last desperate look at her brother alive and real after all these years, then turned and disappeared into the maze of downtown streets. Marcus tried to follow, but his hypothermic body betrayed him. As the paramedics surrounded him, he watched the only family he had left vanish once again into the shadows. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos, but Sarah felt disconnected from it all, watching the medical team work on the stranger she'd pulled from the Millbrook River through a haze of exhaustion. Her wet clothes had been replaced with dry scrubs, and a heated blanket draped her shoulders, yet she couldn't stop shivering. "Mrs. Chen, you need to let us examine you properly." Dr. Martinez's voice cut through her fog. "What you did was incredibly brave, but jumping into freezing water while pregnant—" "Is he going to be okay?" Sarah interrupted, her eyes fixed on the curtained area where they'd wheeled the man. She could hear the steady beep of monitors, voices calling out medical terms she didn't understand. "We're doing everything we can, but right now I'm concerned about you and your baby." The ultrasound gel was cold against her rounded belly, and Sarah held her breath as Dr. Martinez moved the wand across her skin. The familiar whoosh whoosh of her baby's heartbeat filled the small room, strong and steady. Relief flooded through her so intensely that tears sprang to her eyes. "Everything looks good," Dr. Martinez said, his stern expression softening. "Baby's heart rate is normal, no signs of distress. You're lucky, Sarah. Hypothermia during pregnancy can be very dangerous." Through the thin walls, she could hear increased activity from the next room. Urgent voices, the sound of equipment being wheeled in. Her chest tightened with worry for the stranger who'd somehow become her responsibility the moment she'd seen him slip beneath the ice-dark water. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. A police officer entered, notepad in hand, looking apologetic but determined. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened at the river." Sarah recounted the morning's events, her walk, the sound of the ice cracking, the man's desperate struggle in the water. As she spoke, she realized how little she actually knew. Why had he been on the ice in the first place? It wasn't a walking path, wasn't even particularly scenic from that spot. "Did you see anyone else in the area? Any vehicles parked nearby?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "No, Wait." Sarah frowned, trying to piece together the fragmented memory. There might have been a car. Dark-colored, maybe? "I wasn't really paying attention until I heard him fall through." The officer made notes, then looked up with curiosity. "What made you go in after him? Most people would have called for help." Sarah touched her belly unconsciously. "I don't know. I couldn't watch someone die. And by the time help arrived—" She shrugged, unable to articulate the instinct that had driven her into the freezing water. After Officer Rodriguez left, Sarah sat alone, listening to the muffled conversations in the hallway. She thought about calling David, but what would she say? That she'd risked their unborn child's life for a complete stranger? Her husband was already worried enough about her pregnancy after 2 previous miscarriages. Dr. Martinez returned with a younger doctor she didn't recognize. "Sarah, this is Dr. Kim. He's been treating the man you rescued. He'd like to speak with you." Dr. Kim's expression was grave. "Your quick thinking saved his life. He's stable now, but he was very close to drowning. Hypothermia, near drowning, possible head trauma from hitting the ice." He paused. "He's been asking for you. He says he needs to thank you personally." Something in the doctor's tone made Sarah uneasy. Is there something else?" "He's conscious and lucid, but he seems very agitated about something. He won't speak to the police until he talks to you first. Says it's important." Sarah's heart began to race, though she couldn't say why. "I don't understand. I don't even know him." "That's what makes this strange," Dr. Kim said carefully. "When we were getting his information, he asked if you were Sarah Chen. We hadn't told him your name." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What? He knew your name, Sarah, before anyone told him?" A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with her recent plunge into icy water. "That's impossible. I've never seen him before in my life." Dr. Kim exchanged a glance with Dr. Martinez. "He also mentioned something about Millbrook, about your family. He seemed to think you might be related to someone named Margaret Chen." Sarah's breath caught. Margaret Chen had been her mother-in-law, David's mother, who died 15 years ago. But more than that, Margaret Chen had lived in Millbrook her entire life, had raised David here before he moved to the city for college, where they'd met. "I think," Dr. Kim said gently, "you should speak with him." As Sarah followed the doctor down the hallway, her mind raced with questions. Who was this man? And how did he know about Margaret? What was he doing on the ice at dawn, alone and far from any walking trail? And why did she feel, with growing certainty, that rescuing him was about to change everything? The ambulance doors slammed shut with a metallic finality that made Sarah's chest tighten. Through the small rear window, she watched the emergency vehicle disappear around the corner, red lights painting fleeting shadows across the snow-covered street. The stranger, her stranger now somehow, was gone, whisked away to Memorial Hospital with an oxygen mask strapped to his face and paramedics working to stabilize his core temperature. "You should be in there with him," Jake said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. His voice carried that particular blend of admiration and exasperation she'd grown accustomed to over their 3 years of marriage. "You nearly died saving him." Sarah pulled the coat tighter, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, persistent ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold water she'd swallowed. "I'm fine. We're fine." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Something had shifted when she'd looked into that man's eyes, something beyond the desperate gratitude of the nearly drowned. There had been recognition there, a flicker of something familiar that made no sense at all. The drive home passed in relative silence, Jake's hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity while classical music played softly from the radio. Sarah stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook slide past. This small Vermont town had been her whole world for 28 years, its rhythms as predictable as the seasons. She knew every storefront, every tree, every crack in the sidewalk. Nothing ever changed here, which was exactly what she'd always loved about it. So why did everything feel different now? Their house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest colonial with blue shutters that Jake had been meaning to repaint since last spring. Sarah had never minded its imperfections, the slightly crooked front steps, the kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times they replaced the washer, the way the floorboards creaked in the upstairs hallway. It was home, solid and dependable, the kind of place where she could imagine raising children and growing old. But as Jake pulled into their driveway, she found herself studying the house with new eyes, as if seeing it for the first time. "I'll run you a hot bath," Jake said as they stepped inside, immediately moving toward the thermostat. "Dr. Morrison said to watch for signs of hypothermia, and your lips are still blue." Sarah nodded absently, but instead of heading upstairs, she found herself drawn to the living room mantelpiece, where family photos stood in neat silver frames. Her parents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young, her high school graduation, Jake's promotion to fire chief last year, and in the center, the photo she'd looked at 1,000 times before, but had never really questioned, herself as a baby, maybe 6 months old, cradled in her mother's arms in front of this very house. She'd been adopted. She'd always known that, had never made a secret of it. Her parents, Helen and Robert Chen, had been open about their struggles with infertility, about how grateful they were when the private adoption agency had called about a newborn girl who needed a home. Sarah had grown up feeling chosen, wanted, loved beyond measure. So why was she staring at this photo now with a growing sense of unease? "Sarah?" Jake's voice came from the kitchen. "You okay in there?" "Fine," she called back. But her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. She picked up the photo, studying her infant face, trying to see something she'd never noticed before. But it was just her. a pudgy-cheeked baby with dark hair and serious eyes. The phone rang, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the frame. "I'll get it," Jake said, but Sarah was already reaching for the cordless on the side table. "Hello? Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Yes. This is Dr. Patricia Williams at Memorial Hospital. I understand you were the one who rescued Mr. Matthews this afternoon. Is he okay?" The question came out more urgently than she'd intended. "He's stable, which is remarkable considering his condition when he was brought in. But he's been asking for you. Quite insistently, actually. He says it's important, that he needs to tell you something about your family." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "My family? I don't understand. I don't even know him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, I think perhaps you should come in. Mr. Matthews seems to believe otherwise. He keeps saying he's been looking for you for 20 years. The photo slipped from Sarah's other hand, glass shattering against the hardwood floor as it fell. The hospital room felt smaller with each passing hour. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in the narrow bed, her hand resting protectively over her belly as she watched the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest in the bed across from her. The doctors had moved him here after he'd stabilized, something about wanting to monitor them both given their shared ordeal in the icy water. Dr. Martinez had assured her the baby was fine, but Sarah couldn't shake the lingering anxiety that coiled in her stomach like a serpent. Every flutter of movement from within brought both relief and worry. She'd risked everything for a man whose name she didn't even know, and now they were tethered together in this sterile space, breathing the same recycled air. The man stirred, his eyelids fluttering before opening fully. Dark brown eyes, confused and unfocused, swept the room before landing on her. Sarah felt her breath catch. There was something familiar in those eyes, though she couldn't place what. "You're awake," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned his head toward her voice, wincing at the movement. "You're the woman from the river." His voice was rough, scraped raw by cold water and trauma. "You saved me. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No." He struggled to sit up, his hospital gown shifting to reveal a jagged scar across his collarbone. "You were pregnant. You could have died. Your baby could have died." His eyes dropped to her rounded belly, visible beneath the thin hospital blanket. "Why?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question for hours. The rational answer was simple. She'd seen someone in trouble and reacted, but sitting here now, studying his face, she felt that strange pull again, the inexplicable certainty that she'd been meant to be there at that moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just knew I had to." A knock interrupted them. A nurse entered, followed by a man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled coat and tired expression. He had the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much, his eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. "I'm Detective Morrison," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "I need to ask you both some questions about what happened at the river." The stranger in the other bed tensed visibly. "Questions?" "Standard procedure," Morrison assured him, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We found your car at the bottom of the embankment. Skid marks on the road indicate you hit black ice, but I need to understand the sequence of events." Sarah watched as the man's jaw tightened. "I remember driving. The road was slick. The car started sliding and I couldn't control it. Next thing I knew, I was in the water. And your name?" A pause that stretched too long. "David Chen." Morrison scribbled something down. "Address?" Another hesitation. "I'm between places right now, staying in a motel on Route 9. The detective's pen stopped moving. Sarah felt the tension in the room shift, becoming heavier. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied David's face. "Funny thing about that motel," Morrison said casually. "Burned down 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart began to race, not from her earlier exertion, but from the sudden realization that the man she'd risked everything to save might not be who he claimed to be. David's hands clenched the hospital sheets. "I meant the one on Route 12. I get confused after—" He gestured vaguely at his head. "Doctor says you don't have a concussion." Morrison replied smoothly. Clean bill of health, considering. Memory should be just fine. Sarah found herself studying David's profile more intently. The strong jawline, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the temples, the nervous habit of rubbing his thumb against his index finger. Something tugged at her memory, elusive as smoke. "Look," David said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "I don't know what you're trying to get at, but I've told you what happened. I lost control of my car, ended up in the river, and this woman saved my life. End of story." But Morrison wasn't finished. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a wallet, waterlogged and damaged. "We pulled this from your car. Interesting thing is, the license inside says your name is Michael Torres, not David Chen." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Michael Torres. The name hit her like a physical blow, though she couldn't understand why. It echoed in her mind, familiar yet impossible. The man in the bed beside her went completely still. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That wallet isn't mine." "Then whose is it?" Morrison pressed. David, or Michael, or whoever he was, turned to look directly at Sarah. In his eyes she saw fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition. As if he'd been studying her just as intently as she'd been watching him. "I think," he said slowly, "it might have belonged to someone Sarah knew." The warmth of the hospital blanket couldn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in Sarah's bones, not the physical cold from the river that had faded hours ago under the heated blankets and hot tea the nurses had provided. This was something else entirely, a creeping unease that had nothing to do with her dramatic rescue and everything to do with the man lying 3 rooms down the hall. Dr. Martinez had insisted on keeping both her and the stranger overnight for observation. "Hypothermia is nothing to take lightly, especially in your condition," she'd said, her gentle hands checking Sarah's pulse while a fetal monitor confirmed the baby was fine. But Sarah's mind wasn't on medical protocols or prenatal care. It was stuck on a single, impossible detail that made no sense. The scar. She'd seen it clearly when they'd cut away his wet shirt in the emergency room, a thin, crescent-shaped mark just below his left shoulder blade. The same scar she'd traced with her fingertips 1,000 times in old photographs, the one her mother had explained came from falling off a bicycle when he was 7 years old. It was impossible. David Brennan had died 20 years ago. She had the death certificate. She'd visited his grave. She'd spent 2 decades believing her father was nothing more than a collection of faded memories and her mother's carefully curated stories. But scars didn't lie. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Mrs. Chen?" A police officer stepped into the room, notepad in hand. "I'm Officer Williams. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today." Sarah forced herself to focus on his questions, why she'd been at the river, what she'd seen, how the rescue had unfolded. She answered automatically, her mind still reeling. The officer seemed satisfied with her account of a heroic impulse to save a stranger, scribbling notes about her quick thinking and brave actions. "The gentleman you pulled out is awake now," Officer Williams mentioned as he closed his notepad. "David Manning. Seems like a decent guy, just had some bad luck with his car sliding off the road. Says he owes you his life. David Manning." Even the first name was the same. After the officer left, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness of her hospital room, staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to make sense of the impossible. Her phone had been buzzing with concerned texts from Michael, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to respond. How could she explain that she might have just saved her supposedly dead father's life? The logical part of her mind offered rational explanations. Coincidence, similar scars, her emotional state making her see patterns that weren't there, but deep in her chest, in the place where intuition lived, she knew better. She thought about her mother's behavior over the years, the way Linda would sometimes stare out windows with a distant look, the carefully vague answers about David's family, the reluctance to share details about their life together. Sarah had always attributed it to grief, to the pain of losing someone so young. But what if it had been something else entirely? What if it had been guilt? The baby shifted inside her, a gentle reminder of the new life she was carrying. In a few months, she would be someone's mother, responsible for shaping a child's understanding of the world, of family, of truth. The thought of the lies that might have shaped her own life made her stomach turn. She needed answers, but first she needed to see him again. Really see him, not just catch glimpses through the chaos of medical emergencies and rescue protocols. She needed to look into his eyes and know for certain whether the impossible was actually true. Sarah eased herself out of bed, her muscles still aching from her struggle in the icy water. The hallway was quiet except for the distant beeping of monitors and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. Room 237 was 3 doors down, just as she'd counted earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him through the gap. He was awake, staring at the ceiling much as she had been, his profile illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. Even in profile, even after 20 years, even though it should have been impossible, she knew that face. It was older, weathered by 2 decades of life she knew nothing about. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in her mother's photographs, grey threading through hair that had once been the same dark brown as her own. But it was him. It was definitely him. David Brennan, or David Manning as he apparently called himself now, was alive. And tomorrow she was going to find out why her mother had spent 20 years letting her believe he was dead. The warmth of the coffee shop felt surreal after the chaos at the river. Emma sat across from Daniel, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin, watching steam rise from her untouched mug. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from cold, adrenaline, or the strange intensity in Daniel's eyes, she couldn't tell. "You saved my life," he said quietly, his voice still hoarse from the river water he'd swallowed. "I don't even know your name." "Emma. Emma Hartley." She pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "And you're Daniel?" He nodded, then tilted his head slightly. "Hartley. That name." His brow furrowed as if trying to grasp something just beyond reach. "Where are you from originally?" "Here, mostly. Born in St. Mary's Hospital, grew up on Maple Street." Emma studied his face, noting the way his expression shifted from confusion to something deeper. "Why?" Daniel's coffee cup clinked against the saucer as he set it down with unsteady hands. "This is going to sound crazy, but do you know anything about your adoption?" The question hit Emma like a physical blow. Her breath caught, and instinctively her hand moved to her belly. "What did you just say?" "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "How could you possibly know I was adopted?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was steel in it. "I've never told anyone except my husband." Daniel ran his hands through his still damp hair, leaving it disheveled. "Because I've been looking for someone. My sister. She was adopted 20 years ago, and I—" He stopped, really looking at Emma's face for the first time since they'd sat down. The color drained from his cheeks. "Oh my God. Your sister?" Emma felt the world tilting sideways. "That's impossible. My adoption records are sealed. I don't have any siblings." "You have a small scar above your left eyebrow," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "From when you fell off a swing set when you were 3. And there's a birthmark on your right shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon." Emma's hand flew to her eyebrow, touching the thin line that makeup usually covered. How could he know about the birthmark? She'd never shown it to anyone except doctors and Mark. "Stop, just stop talking." But Daniel continued, leaning forward urgently. "You were afraid of thunderstorms as a kid, but you loved the rain. You used to sneak out onto the back porch during storms just to watch the lightning." His eyes were bright with tears now. "And you had this stuffed rabbit, brown and white, with one ear shorter than the other. You called it Patches." The coffee shop seemed to fade around them. Emma could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the baby shifting restlessly inside her, as if sensing her distress. "How do you know these things?" "Because I was there. I was your big brother." Daniel's voice broke slightly. "I was 7 when they took you away. I never forgot." Emma shook her head violently. "No, this is insane. You're some stranger who nearly drowned, and now you're trying to convince me that your real name is Elena, Daniel interrupted softly. Elena Rose Kozlov, and I've been searching for you for 13 years. The name hit something deep in Emma's memory, like a key turning in a long-locked door. Elena. She'd had dreams about that name, had sometimes caught herself almost responding to it when she heard it called out in public places. Her therapist had said it was normal for adopted children to fantasize about their original identities. Kozlov, she repeated, testing the sound. That's Russian. Our father was. He died when you were 2. You probably don't remember him, but our mother... Daniel's jaw tightened. She had problems, addiction mostly. When social services finally intervened, they said I could stay with our aunt, but you needed a fresh start, a real family. Emma felt tears starting to blur her vision. They told me my birth parents died in a car accident, that I had no other family. They lied to protect you, to make sure you could start over completely. Daniel reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. I've been trying to find you through official channels for years, but the records are locked tight. I hired a private investigator last year who traced you to this town, but couldn't get an exact address. Is that why you were at the river? Emma asked, her mind reeling. Looking for me? Daniel's expression darkened. Not exactly. I was having a bad day. The anniversary of losing you is next week, and I'd just gotten another dead end from the investigator. I wasn't thinking clearly. The implication hung between them like smoke. Emma realized with a chill that she hadn't just saved a stranger from drowning, she'd saved her brother from something much more deliberate. Daniel, she whispered, finally understanding the weight of what had happened. What were you really doing in that river? The hospital room felt suffocating despite the steady hum of the ventilation system. Sarah sat in the chair beside David's bed, her hands unconsciously resting on her belly as she watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The doctors had said he was stable, but the pale cast to his skin and the network of tubes and wires made him look fragile, almost ghost-like. She shouldn't be here. Mark had made that clear when he'd stormed out 3 hours ago, his parting words still echoing in her mind. You don't even know this man, Sarah. What are you doing to our family? But something kept her rooted to the spot, an inexplicable pull she couldn't rationalize or shake. David stirred, his eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, his gaze wandering across the ceiling before finding her face. When their eyes met, Sarah felt that same jolt of recognition that had struck her by the river. You stayed, he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier. I wanted to make sure you were okay. She leaned forward slightly. How are you feeling? Like I'd been hit by a truck that was also somehow made of ice. A weak smile crossed his lips. The nurse told me what you did. Thank you. I don't think I properly said that before. Sarah nodded, but found herself studying his features more intently now that he was awake and alert. There was something about the shape of his eyes, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other when he smiled. Familiar in a way that made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. Can I ask you something? She said, surprising herself with her directness. Shoot, have we met before? I know it sounds crazy, but I keep feeling like we know each other, David finished, his expression growing serious. I've been thinking the same thing since I saw you on that riverbank. There's something... He trailed off, studying her face with the same intensity she was giving his. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Come home. We need to talk. She glanced at it and set the phone aside without responding. What's your last name? David asked suddenly. Chen. Well, Hartwell now, but I was born Sarah Chen. Something shifted in David's expression, a shadow passing across his features. Chen, he repeated slowly. Where did you grow up? Here in Millbrook, mostly. But I was adopted when I was 7. The words came out before she could stop them. She rarely talked about her adoption, especially not with strangers. I lived with the Riverside Children's Home before that. David's face went completely white. He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his foreline. "The children's home," he said, his voice barely audible. "What year?" Sarah's heart began to race, though she couldn't say why. "I was there from 1998 to 2005. Why are you asking me this?" David closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "A little sister. We were separated when our parents died in a car accident. I was 12, she was 5. The state split us up because the family that wanted to adopt me couldn't take both of us." The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. What was her name? Su-Lin. Su-Lin Chen. She had this birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon, and she was terrified of thunderstorms but loved the rain when it was gentle. David's voice broke slightly. "I've been looking for her for 20 years. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder, where beneath her sweater lay a crescent-shaped birthmark she'd always been self-conscious about. The room felt like it was spinning now, memories she'd buried long ago beginning to surface, a boy with kind eyes reading to her, someone singing a lullaby in Mandarin when she couldn't sleep, a promise that he'd find her someday. "David," she whispered, and the name felt different on her tongue now, weighted with recognition. David Chen. Su-Lin. The way he said her birth name broke something open inside her chest. 20 years of wondering, of feeling like a piece of her was missing, suddenly crystallizing into this impossible moment. They stared at each other across the small space between the bed and chair, the magnitude of what had just happened settling around them like snow. Sarah's baby chose that moment to kick, a strong flutter that made her gasp and place both hands on her belly. "I'm going to be an uncle," David said wonderingly, and then they were both crying, reaching for each other across the impossible gulf of years and circumstances that had led them to this sterile hospital room, where everything they thought they knew about their lives had just changed forever. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunch crowd, but Sarah barely noticed the clatter of trays or the hum of conversation. She sat across from Marcus, watching him methodically tear his sandwich into small pieces without eating any of it. 3 days had passed since she'd pulled him from the river, and while his body had recovered, something deeper remained broken. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her hand resting on her rounded belly where the baby had been unusually active all morning. "We can wait until you're ready." Marcus looked up, his dark eyes still haunted but clearer than they'd been. "No. I've been running from this for too long." He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket and extracted a small, creased photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table between them. Sarah's breath caught. The image showed a young woman with long auburn hair, laughing at something off camera. She was standing in front of a blue sedan, one hand resting protectively on her visibly pregnant stomach. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same green eyes that Sarah saw in her own reflection, the same stubborn chin that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. "Her name was Rebecca," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca Chen. She was everything to me." Sarah's world tilted. The name hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd never heard it before. Her adoptive parents had told her almost nothing about her birth mother, only that she'd been young and unable to care for a baby. The woman in the photograph looked barely older than Sarah was now. "She was a student at the university," Marcus continued, seemingly unaware of Sarah's growing shock. "Pre-med, brilliant, determined to become a doctor. We met at a coffee shop where she worked weekends to pay for textbooks." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She made terrible coffee, but I kept going back anyway." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the small jade pendant she'd worn for as long as she could remember, the only thing she had from her birth mother. Marcus's eyes followed the movement and went wide. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice cracking. Sarah's fingers closed around the pendant. It was with me when I was adopted. They said it was from my birth mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her with growing recognition, taking in details he'd been too traumatized to notice before. The shape of her nose, the way she tilted her head when concentrating, the stubborn set of her jaw that was so achingly familiar. "What's your birthday?" he whispered. "March 15th. The words came out strangled. 1994. Marcus buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. When he looked up again, tears streamed down his cheeks. "I gave her that pendant. For her 20th birthday, 2 weeks before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. 29 years old, she'd long since made peace with never knowing her origins. But now, sitting across from this broken man she'd saved from drowning, the pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer would destroy something inside her. Marcus took a shuddering breath. "There were complications during delivery. The doctors, they said they could save one of you, but not both. Rebecca, his voice broke completely. "She chose you. She made them promise to save you." The cafeteria noise faded to white static. Sarah felt as though she were drowning herself, pulled under by waves of grief for a mother she'd never known, and a father she'd just found in the most impossible way. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her emotional turmoil. I was 19 and devastated, and I didn't know how to take care of a baby when I could barely take care of myself," Marcus continued through his tears. "The social worker said there was a family who desperately wanted a child. I thought you'd be better off without me." Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "You were just a kid yourself. I've regretted it every day since." Marcus turned his hand palm up, gripping her fingers like a lifeline. "I've spent 29 years wondering if you were okay, if you were happy, if you ever thought about us. And then 3 days ago, you saved my life." "Maybe," Sarah said, her voice thick with tears. "Maybe we saved each other." They sat in the bustling cafeteria, two strangers who were no longer strangers, connected by tragedy and loss and an impossible coincidence that felt more like destiny. Around them, life continued its normal rhythm, but for Sarah and Marcus, everything had changed. The past had finally caught up with them, bringing with it questions that demanded answers and a future neither of them could have imagined. The silence in Elena's living room felt heavier than the snowfall outside. David sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since grown cold, while she stared at the ultrasound photo on her coffee table. The black and white image seemed to mock them both, a symbol of new life in the midst of revelations that had shattered everything they thought they knew. "Tell me about the fire," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. David's shoulders sagged. "I've tried to forget it for 20 years. He set down his mug with trembling fingers. "Our parents were fighting that night. They'd been fighting for months about money, about Dad's drinking, about everything. Mom had threatened to leave and take us with her." Elena placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. "What happened?" "I was supposed to watch you while they went out to dinner. Some last attempt to fix things. You were only 3, so curious about everything." David's voice cracked. "I was angry about missing a party with my friends. I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been." The wind rattled the windows, and Elena pulled her sweater tighter around herself. "The candles?" "You'd been fascinated by them all evening. Mom had lit them for dinner, and when they left, I was supposed to blow them out. But I was on the phone with my girlfriend, complaining about having to babysit." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with decades of guilt. "You must have climbed on a chair to reach them. I found you in the living room, trying to light a piece of paper. The curtains were already burning." Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You saved me." "I tried to. I got you outside, but then I realized I'd left my baseball glove, this stupid glove that Dad had given me for my birthday. I was so angry at him, but it was the only thing he'd given me that wasn't second-hand." David buried his face in his hands. "I told you to stay by the tree in the front yard and ran back inside. The ceiling came down in the hallway. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, they told me you were gone." "Gone how?" Elena's heart was racing, the baby responding to her elevated pulse with increased movement. The social worker said you'd been placed with a family immediately, that it was better for both of us to start fresh. Different homes, different names if needed. They said the trauma would be easier to heal if we weren't constant reminders to each other. His voice turned bitter. I was 15, old enough to age out of the system soon anyway. You were young enough to forget. Elena thought of Margaret Walsh, the woman who'd raised her with fierce love and endless patience. But I didn't forget everything. I've had dreams about a fire, about someone calling my name. I always thought they were nightmares. I called for you that night. I kept screaming your name until the smoke got too thick. David met her eyes. What did they tell you about your family? That my parents died in an accident when I was small. That I was lucky to be adopted so quickly. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. My adoptive mother, Margaret, she was wonderful. She gave me everything I could have wanted, but I always felt like something was missing. Our parents did die, David said quietly. Car accident 2 months after the fire. They were coming back from a meeting with the insurance adjuster. The social worker said they'd been drinking. The weight of it all settled over Elena like a heavy blanket. She'd spent her entire life wondering about her origins, creating elaborate fantasies about her birth family, never imagining the truth was so close to the surface of her nightmares. "How did you end up here, in Millbrook?" she asked. "I've been looking for you for 20 years. Every town I've lived in, every job I've taken, I've checked records, talked to social workers, searched online databases. I moved here 6 months ago following a lead that didn't pan out, but I liked the town. It felt peaceful." He gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall. "I never imagined you'd be the one to pull me out of that river." Elena looked at the ultrasound image again, thinking of the family she was creating. "Do you think I was meant to be there that morning?" "I don't know about meant to be," David said, "but I'm grateful you were, even if this changes everything." He paused. "Does it? Change everything?" She considered the question seriously. The man sitting across from her was a stranger, yet somehow familiar. The brother she'd never known she'd lost, found again through circumstances neither could have predicted. "I think it changes everything and nothing at all," she said finally. "You're still the person I pulled from the river. I'm still pregnant and scared and figuring out my life. But now we're not alone," David finished. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white, as if offering them a clean slate to begin again. The hospital cafeteria hummed with the quiet desperation of families caught between hope and heartbreak. Maya sat across from David, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 38 years. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely audible above the distant clatter of dishes. "About the day I pulled you from the river." David leaned forward, his coffee untouched. "What about it?" Maya's fingers traced the rim of her cup, buying herself precious seconds. "I wasn't just taking a walk that morning. I was running away. The admission felt like exhaling poison. Tom and I had this terrible fight about the baby, about everything really, and I couldn't breathe in that house anymore." "Maya?" "No, let me finish." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I was so angry, so hurt, that I didn't care about the cold or how far I'd walked. I was thinking about leaving, about disappearing somewhere he'd never find me." Her voice cracked. "And then I saw you in the water, and suddenly none of my problems mattered. Only you mattered." David reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "You saved my life, but I almost didn't." The tears came now, hot and relentless. "I stood there for at least 10 seconds, maybe more, watching you struggle. Part of me was so wrapped up in my own pain that I almost walked away. But you didn't. What kind of person hesitates when someone is drowning? What kind of mother am I going to be if I can't even—" "Stop." David's voice was firm but gentle. "You're human. You were in pain, probably in shock from the cold, but when it mattered, you acted. You risked everything." Maya wiped her eyes with a napkin, the rough paper scratching against her skin. "Tom thinks I was reckless. He says I could have killed our baby. What do you think?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Maya had been asking herself the same thing for days, replaying those moments in the icy water, feeling again the desperate strength that had surged through her body as she fought to pull David to shore. "I think," she said slowly, "that some things are worth the risk, but I also think Tom might be right about me being reckless. I've been making decisions based on emotion instead of logic, and now—" She gestured vaguely at the hospital around them. "Now I'm here again, and Tom's afraid I'm going to lose the baby, and I don't know how to make him understand that some choices aren't really choices at all." David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Can I ask you something? That fight you had with Tom, what was it really about?" Maya hesitated. The truth was complicated, tangled up in years of small disappointments and unspoken resentments. He got offered a promotion, department head at the university. It would mean longer hours, more travel, but significantly more money. Good timing with the baby coming, but he didn't discuss it with me. He just accepted, then came home and announced it like it was already decided. Like my opinion didn't matter. The anger she'd been suppressing bubbled up again. "I'm about to have our child, David. I'm scared and excited and overwhelmed, and instead of talking to me about this major life change, he makes the decision alone and expects me to be grateful." David nodded slowly. "So, you felt like he didn't see you as an equal partner?" "Exactly." Maya felt a rush of relief at being understood so clearly. "And when I tried to explain that, he said I was being irrational, that pregnancy hormones were making me emotional. Like my feelings weren't valid just because I'm carrying his child. That must have felt like a betrayal." It did. It felt like he'd already decided who I was going to be as a mother, as his wife, without consulting me. Like I was just supposed to fit into this neat little box he'd constructed. Maya paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes I wonder if he even sees me anymore, or just the idea of what he wants me to be." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people recognize something true has been spoken. Maya found herself studying David's face, noting the way he listened without judgment, without immediately offering solutions or dismissing her concerns. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For not telling me I'm overreacting, for not suggesting that pregnancy is making me crazy." David smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it reached his eyes. "Maya, you pulled a drowning man from a frozen river while 6 months pregnant. I think we can safely say you're not the type to overreact to anything." She laughed despite herself, surprising them both. Outside the cafeteria windows, snow had begun to fall again. The manila folder trembled in Sarah's hands as she sat across from Detective Morrison in the cramped police station office. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes appear deeper than she remembered from their first meeting 3 days ago. "I need to show you something," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent delivering difficult news. "But first, I want you to understand that what I'm about to share changes everything we thought we knew about your adoption." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Beside her, David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers intertwined with hers in a grip that had grown tighter with each revelation. The bruises on his face from the river accident had faded to yellow-green, but the emotional wounds they'd both sustained seemed to deepen daily. Morrison opened the folder and withdrew a photograph that looked like it had been handled countless times over the decades. The edges were worn, the colors slightly faded, but the image was clear enough to make Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A young woman, barely out of her teens, stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and David's unmistakable jawline. Between them sat 2 children, a boy of perhaps 4 or 5, and a baby girl with wispy blonde hair and Sarah's distinctive green eyes. "This was taken 6 months before the fire," Morrison said quietly. "Robert and Elena Hendricks with their children, David and Sarah." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She stared at the photograph, searching for any detail that might prove Morrison wrong, but the evidence was undeniable. The baby's face was her own, captured in that perfect moment before tragedy would tear their family apart. "That's impossible," David whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah could see recognition dawning in his expression, the same terrible understanding that was washing over her. Morrison continued, his tone gentle but relentless. "After the fire, when they found Elena's body and Robert was presumed dead, the authorities discovered that Sarah had been pulled from the burning house by a neighbor. She was severely injured, suffering from smoke inhalation and burns that required extensive treatment. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her left shoulder, where a small, crescent-shaped scar had always puzzled her adoptive parents. They'd told her it was from a childhood accident they knew nothing about. During her recovery, Sarah developed pneumonia and was hospitalized for months. The system was overwhelmed, records were misplaced, and somehow the connection between the siblings was lost. David went to his grandmother, Margaret Hendricks, while Sarah recovered in foster care before being placed for adoption. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Every breath felt like she was drowning again, just as she had felt when she'd plunged into that icy river to save a stranger. Except the stranger hadn't been a stranger at all. "Our father," David said, his voice breaking on the words. "He's been alive all these years?" Morrison nodded grimly. "Robert Hendricks survived the fire, but he suffered traumatic brain injury and severe burns. He's been in and out of care facilities for 2 decades. His memories fragmented, his identity sometimes unclear even to himself. When you pulled him from that river, Sarah, you were saving the father you never knew you'd lost." Sarah doubled over as if she'd been punched. The irony was too cruel, too impossible to comprehend. She had spent her entire adult life feeling an inexplicable pull toward helping others, driven by dreams she couldn't understand, and a persistent sense that something was missing from her life. And all along, the missing piece had been right there: her brother, her father, the family that had been stolen from her by bureaucratic incompetence and tragic circumstance. "Where is he now?" she managed to ask through her tears. "St. Mary's Hospital, recovering from hypothermia and pneumonia." "But Sarah," Morrison's voice carried a warning, "you need to understand that he may not remember you. His condition is complicated. Some days he's lucid, others he's lost in memories that might be 20 years old." David stood abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out onto the parking lot. "All this time," he said, his back to them, "I had dreams about a little girl. A sister who used to follow me around, who laughed when I read her stories. Grandmother said they were fantasies, that I was an only child. She made me believe I was imagining things." Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, not the sharp pain of fresh wounds, but the deep ache of old ones finally being acknowledged. "I used to dream about a boy who taught me to catch fireflies," she whispered, "and a woman who sang lullabies in a language I didn't recognize." Romanian, David said, turning back to face her. "Mama sang to us in Romanian." The word mama hung between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as Sarah clutched the manila envelope containing the DNA results. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold this time, but from the weight of what she was about to discover. Michael sat beside her on the uncomfortable plastic chair, his own envelope unopened in his lap. "On 3?" he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. The past week had been a blur of medical appointments, forms, and sleepless nights wondering if the impossible could actually be true. The social worker had been kind but thorough, explaining that while DNA testing was routine in these circumstances, the emotional impact could be profound regardless of the results. "1," Sarah began, her fingers finding the edge of the envelope seal. "2," Michael continued, his knuckles white as he gripped his own envelope. They tore open the papers simultaneously, Sarah's eyes scanning desperately for the crucial percentage that would either shatter or rebuild everything she thought she knew about her life. The technical jargon blurred together until she found the line that mattered: Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Michael's sharp intake of breath told her he'd found his answer too. 23 years, Sarah whispered, staring at the paper as if the numbers might rearrange themselves. I've been looking for you for 23 years, and you were living 2 hours away. Michael set his results aside and turned to face her fully. The resemblance she'd noticed before now seemed blindingly obvious. The same stubborn cowlick that refused to lie flat, the identical way their eyebrows drew together when concentrating, even the small scar above their left eyebrows that they'd both dismissed as childhood accidents. The detective said I was found by the river, Michael said slowly, pieces clicking into place. The same river where you pulled me out last month. The same damn river? Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. It's like it was calling us both back somehow. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Nothing sounds crazy anymore, Michael replied, running his hands through his hair. I spent my whole life wondering why the Hendersons never officially adopted me, why they kept promising someday but never followed through. Now I understand. They were probably terrified that someone would come looking. The weight of lost years settled between them like a physical presence. Sarah thought of all the birthdays she'd celebrated alone, imagining what her little brother might look like, what he might be interested in, whether he was happy. Michael had been building furniture with his hands, creating beautiful things from raw wood, while she'd been teaching children to read, nurturing other people's kids while aching for news of her own lost family. Mom never stopped looking, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She hired private investigators until we couldn't afford it anymore. She kept your room exactly the same until she died 5 years ago. Your little toy trucks are still lined up on the windowsill. Michael's composure finally cracked. I don't remember her face, he admitted, tears streaming down his cheeks. I have these fragments, someone singing, the smell of vanilla, safe feelings, but I don't remember her face. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo album she'd carried like a talisman. Here, she said, showing him a picture of their mother, holding a toddler with unmistakable dark hair and serious eyes. This was taken about 2 weeks before you disappeared. You'd just learned to say Sarah, but you called me Sawa. Michael stared at the photo for a long moment, his finger hovering over the screen as if he could touch the past. She looks kind. I wish I could remember her voice. She used to sing You Are My Sunshine when you had nightmares, Sarah offered, and she made these elaborate pancake breakfasts every Sunday. You always wanted yours in the shape of a dinosaur. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The hospital continued its rhythm around them, nurses walking briskly past, the distant chime of elevator doors, the low murmur of conversations from other families dealing with their own life-changing moments. What happens now? Michael asked eventually. Sarah looked down at her belly, where her daughter was currently practicing what felt like soccer kicks against her ribs. Now you get to be an uncle, she said with a watery smile. And I get to tell my daughter about the uncle who survived against impossible odds, who grew up to save people's homes the same way his sister tries to save people's lives. Michael placed his hand gently on her arm. And maybe, he said quietly, we both finally get to stop looking for something we didn't even know we'd lost. Outside the hospital windows, snow was beginning to fall again, but neither of them felt the cold anymore. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt too ordinary for the magnitude of what they contained. Sarah held the sealed envelope with trembling fingers, her other hand instinctively moving to her growing belly where the baby had been unusually active all night, as if sensing the weight of impending revelation. Marcus sat across from her at the kitchen table, his face pale but determined. The past week had been a careful dance around the possibility that hung between them, that the man she'd pulled from the icy river might be the brother she'd lost 20 years ago. Whatever it says, he whispered, we'll figure it out together. Sarah tore open the envelope, her eyes scanning the technical language until she found the line that mattered. 99.7% probability of sibling relationship confirmed. The paper fluttered to the table as Sarah's hands flew to cover her mouth. 20 years of wondering, of hoping, of gradually accepting that Thomas was gone forever. All of it crashing down in a single moment of impossible truth. Sarah? Marcus reached across the table, but she was already standing, pacing to the window that overlooked the river where everything had begun. "It's him," she breathed. "Thomas is alive. Thomas Issue." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 2 decades of separation. Marcus, Thomas, stared at the results as if they might change if he looked hard enough. "I don't remember," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't remember being Thomas. I don't remember you." Sarah turned from the window, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You were 7. You had this laugh that could fill a whole room, and you collected rocks from the garden, convinced they were all special treasures. You followed me everywhere, even when I pretended to be annoyed." "The dreams," Marcus whispered suddenly. "I've been having these dreams since the accident. A little girl with dark hair reading to me, a woman singing lullabies." He looked up at her, wonder and pain warring in his expression. "Was that you? Was that Mom?" "Mom sang Blackbird every night before bed," Sarah said, sinking back into her chair. "And I read You Where the Wild Things Are so many times I had it memorized." Marcus closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "It's like looking through fog. I can almost see it, but when I try to focus, it disappears." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the gentle tick of the clock on the wall. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her brother's hand, in hers. "Tell me what happened that day," she said softly, "when you fell through the ice." Marcus's grip tightened. "I remember being cold, so incredibly cold, and then nothing until I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. The doctors said I'd been hypothermic too long, that the lack of oxygen had caused memory loss. The Kellys, they'd been at the river that morning, saw the whole thing. They said no one else was around, that there was no family looking for me." "But we were looking," Sarah said fiercely. "Mom never stopped looking. We searched for months. The police, the dive teams, everyone said you'd drowned, that your body had been swept downriver. We held a funeral with an empty casket. The Kellys weren't from around here, they were just passing through when they found me. When no one came forward to claim me, they took me in, eventually adopted me legally. They were good people, Sarah. They loved me as their own son." Sarah nodded, understanding even through her grief. "And they're both gone now?" "Car accident 5 years ago." Marcus wiped his eyes. "I never questioned my past because they made sure I never felt like I was missing anything. But there was always this emptiness, like a piece of me was lost somewhere I couldn't reach." "You were reaching back to us," Sarah said. "All this time, you were trying to come home." They sat in the growing daylight, 2 siblings separated by 20 years of different lives, different families, different names. The man Sarah had known as Marcus Kelly was her little brother Thomas, and the recognition was finally filtering through the shock. The familiar gesture of running his hand through his hair when nervous, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the stubborn set of his jaw that had been so characteristic even at 7 years old. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. "I mean, what does this make us? I'm not the brother you lost, and you're not the sister I never remembered. We're different people now." Sarah felt the baby kick, a strong flutter that made her gasp softly. "Maybe we're exactly who we were meant to become," she said. "Maybe everything that happened was leading us back to each other. You nearly drowning, me being there to save you, what are the odds?" "Pretty astronomical," Marcus admitted, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Then we start from here," Sarah said. "We figure out how to be family again." The hospital room felt smaller, with everyone crowded inside. Maya's mother sat rigid in the chair beside the bed, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Dr. Harrison stood near the window, his expression carefully neutral as he reviewed the paternity test results one final time. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Thomas pace near the foot of her bed. He'd been doing that for the past 10 minutes, running his hands through his hair and muttering under his breath. The bandage on his temple from the river accident seemed insignificant now compared to the weight of what they were about to learn. "The results are conclusive," Dr. Harrison finally said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Thomas, you are Maya's biological brother." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Maya felt the baby shift inside her, as if sensing the seismic change in the world around them. Thomas stopped pacing abruptly, his face draining of color. 23 years, her mother whispered, the words barely audible. 23 years I've wondered if you were alive. Thomas turned to face her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You knew about me? I held you when you were born." The admission came out broken, fractured by decades of grief. "You were so small, barely 5 pounds. The doctors said you might not make it through the night." Maya struggled to sit up straighter, her mind reeling. "Mom, what are you talking about? You never said anything about having another baby." Her mother's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked between Maya and Thomas. "I was 17. Your father and I weren't married yet. My parents, they said it would ruin everything. The family reputation, our future. They arranged for the adoption before you were even born." "Jesus Christ," Thomas breathed, sinking into the empty chair. "All this time, I thought my birth parents just didn't want me. I wanted you every single day." The raw pain in her mother's voice made Maya's chest ache. "I named you before they took you away, Samuel. It means heard by God." Thomas flinched as if he'd been slapped. "Samuel Thomas Brennan. That's my full name. The Brennans, they kept Samuel as my middle name." "They were supposed to keep in touch," her mother continued, her voice gaining strength. "Send pictures, letters. But after the first year, everything stopped. I hired a private investigator when Maya was 10, but he said the family had moved, left no forwarding address." Maya felt overwhelmed, drowning in revelations. "Dad knew about this? He wanted to find you too. We tried for years, but it was like you'd vanished." Her mother looked at Thomas with wonder, as if he might disappear again. "When we couldn't have more children after Maya, I used to imagine you were out there somewhere, happy and loved." "I was," Thomas said quietly. "The Brennans were good people, but I always felt like something was missing, like there was this hole I couldn't fill." The irony wasn't lost on Maya. She'd pulled her own brother from the icy river, saved him without knowing who he was. The man she'd risked her pregnancy for was family she'd never known she had. "The accident," she said suddenly. "What were you doing on that bridge?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I was meeting someone, a private investigator I'd hired to help find my birth family. He'd traced some records to this area, thought there might be a connection to the hospital here." "You were looking for us," Maya realized. "My whole life," he confirmed. "Especially after the Brennans died in a car accident 3 years ago. They were the only family I had left, and I felt so alone. I needed to know where I came from." Her mother stood up abruptly, crossing to Thomas with determination Maya had rarely seen from her. Without hesitation, she pulled him into a fierce embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry I let them take you. I should have fought harder." Thomas wrapped his arms around her, and Maya watched her brother, cry for the first time. "You were just a kid yourself. I understand." "No more secrets," her mother said, pulling back to cup his face in her hands. "No more lost time. You're part of this family now if you want to be." Maya felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, as if celebrating the reunion. "Looks like your nephew or niece approves," she said, managing a watery smile. Thomas looked at her with amazement. "Uncle Thomas, I like the sound of that." "Uncle Sam," Maya corrected gently, and his smile was brilliant. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, but inside the hospital room, something that had been broken for 23 years was finally beginning to heal. The old photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the faces looking back at her. A younger version of the woman she'd just met, standing beside a man she didn't recognize, holding a baby that could only be David. The timestamp in the corner read March 1983, just months after her own birth. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady hum of the hospital's ventilation system. "This woman, Elena, she says David is her son, but how does she know about me?" Dr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, his expression grave. "Sarah, there's something we need to discuss. When we ran David's blood work after the accident, we discovered something unusual. His blood type, combined with some genetic markers we routinely check, suggested a possible familial connection. We weren't sure how to approach it, given the circumstances." Tom stepped closer, his protective instincts flaring. "What kind of connection?" "The kind that typically indicates siblings," Dr. Harrison said gently. "We'd need more comprehensive testing to be certain, but the preliminary indicators are quite strong." Sarah's legs gave out and she sank into the nearest chair. The baby kicked sharply as if sensing her distress. "That's impossible. I'm an only child. My parents would have told me—" "Would they?" The voice came from behind them. Elena stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "May I come in?" Tom moved protectively in front of Sarah, but she reached for his hand, steadying herself. "Please, I need to understand what's happening." Elena entered slowly, her gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "You have his eyes," she said softly. "David's eyes. Your father's eyes." "My father died when I was 2, Sarah said firmly. "His name was Michael Chen. Michael Chen was a good man who raised you as his own," Elena replied, settling into the chair across from them. "But your biological father was James Morrison, my husband, David's father." The room spun around Sarah. She gripped Tom's hand tighter, using his strength to anchor herself in the moment. "You're saying David and I are—" "Half-siblings," Elena confirmed. "Different mothers, same father. James had an affair 25 years ago with a woman named Linda Brennan. When she became pregnant, she told James she wanted nothing from him. No money, no involvement, nothing. She just wanted to disappear and start over." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "My mother's maiden name was Brennan." Elena nodded sadly. "Linda moved across the country, married Michael Chen when you were 6 months old, and apparently never looked back. James respected her wishes, though I know it tormented him. He would wonder about you, especially around your birthday." "How could you possibly know it's me?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. "There must be thousands of women born that year with the last name Brennan." Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a small yellowed envelope. "Because 3 months ago, David hired a private investigator to find you. James died 2 years ago, and David felt he had the right to know if he had a sister. The investigator tracked down your adoption records, your marriage certificate, everything." She handed Sarah the envelope. "David was planning to contact you after the holidays. He was nervous about disrupting your life, especially with the baby coming." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a comprehensive report detailing her life, her marriage to Tom, her job at the veterinary clinic, even their current address. Attached was a handwritten note in David's careful script. "I hope someday we can meet. I hope you'll forgive me for intruding on the life you've built. I just need to know my sister." Tears blurred her vision. "All this time, I've felt like something was missing, like there was a piece of me I couldn't find." "David felt the same way," Elena said softly. "When we heard about the accident on the news, when they described the pregnant woman who'd saved him, Sarah Morrison, we knew it couldn't be coincidence. You'd taken his name when you married Tom, but you were already a Morrison. You were already family." Tom squeezed her shoulder. "Sarah, the day you saw David in the water, you said something felt familiar about him, like you knew him." She nodded, remembering that inexplicable pull she'd felt, the certainty that she had to save him regardless of the risk. "I couldn't explain it then. I thought it was just adrenaline, but you recognized him," Elena finished. On some level, you knew. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat gently. If you'd like to proceed with the genetic testing, we can have definitive results within a few days. But given David's current condition, I think the most important thing right now is that he's not alone. Sarah looked at the photograph again, studying David's infant face, then at Elena's hopeful expression. For the first time since the accident, she felt something shift inside her, not just the baby moving, but something deeper, a sense of completeness she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. "I'd like to sit with him," she said quietly. "My brother. I'd like to be there when he wakes up." The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Maya held the sealed envelope in her trembling hands, her 8-month belly making it awkward to lean forward in the kitchen chair. David sat across from her, his own envelope unopened on the scratched wooden table between them. 20 years, she whispered, staring at the official laboratory seal. 20 years. I've wondered if my brother was alive somewhere. David's fingers traced the edge of his envelope. The man who had emerged from the icy river 3 months ago looked nothing like the broken soul she'd pulled from the water. Color had returned to his cheeks, and the hollow desperation in his eyes had been replaced by something Maya had learned to recognize as hope. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, his voice barely audible. "The night I was taken. I remember a girl crying, someone calling my name, but the memories, they're like fragments of a shattered mirror." Maya's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had been unusually active all morning, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. She thought of her mother, who had died 5 years ago, still believing her son was dead, still carrying the guilt of that terrible night when she'd turned away for just a moment and he'd vanished from the playground. "The Hendersons raised me," David continued, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere beyond Maya's shoulder. "They weren't cruel, but they weren't my family. I always felt like something was missing, like there was this hole in my chest that I couldn't name." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the old wall clock and the distant sound of traffic beyond the windows. Maya had spent countless hours in this same chair as a child, helping her mother clip missing person flyers from newspapers, updating the description as years passed. And David would have grown taller, his features changing from a 5-year-old's softness to a boy's sharper angles. "My mother kept your room exactly the same for 10 years, Maya said, her voice catching. "Your toy cars lined up on the windowsill, your dinosaur sheets on the bed. She used to sit in there sometimes and read stories aloud, like you might come home and want to hear the ending." David's composure cracked slightly. "I used to have dreams about dinosaurs, and cars, always cars lined up in perfect rows. The Hendersons thought it was just a quirky habit, but it felt important, like I was remembering something sacred." Maya's hands shook as she broke the seal on her envelope. The scientific language blurred together until she found the crucial line: 99.97% probability of full sibling relationship confirmed. The paper fluttered to the table as her breath caught in her throat. David opened his envelope with deliberate slowness, his movements careful and measured. She watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment when 20 years of questions found their answer. His shoulders sagged as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted. "Daniel," Maya whispered, using his birth name for the first time since that terrible day when he'd disappeared. "Your name was Daniel." He looked up at her, and Maya saw herself in his eyes. The same green flecked with gold that their father had carried, the same stubborn set to the jaw that their mother had always said would get them both in trouble someday. "I pulled you from that river," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "Of all the people in the world, all the places you could have been that day, I pulled my own brother from the water." Daniel, reached across the table and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused from the construction work he'd found after leaving the hospital, honest work that had helped him rebuild not just his strength, but his sense of purpose. "You saved me twice," he said quietly. "Once from drowning, and once from never knowing who I really was." The baby kicked hard against Maya's ribs, and she laughed despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "He knows," she said, guiding Daniel's hand to where their nephew was making his presence known. "Somehow he knows he's going to have an uncle." Daniel's face transformed with wonder as he felt the strong kicks against his palm. "What are you going to name him?" Maya had been carrying the name in her heart for months, waiting for the right moment to speak it aloud. "Daniel," she said simply. "His name is going to be Daniel." The two siblings sat in the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, hands connected across the table and across 20 years of separation, feeling the new life moving between them like a promise that some stories, even the most broken ones, could still find their way to healing. The hospital corridors felt different now, charged with an electric tension that made every footstep echo like thunder. Sarah walked beside Marcus, her hand protectively cradling her belly where their baby moved restlessly, as if sensing the storm about to break. Detective Rodriguez led them toward the conference room where Margaret Chen waited, her weathered face a mask of resignation and buried grief. 23 years, Margaret whispered as they entered, her voice barely audible above the hum of fluorescent lights. 23 years I've carried this weight. Sarah's breath caught. The woman who had raised Marcus, who had been his anchor through foster care and beyond, looked suddenly fragile. Her usually steady hands trembled as she reached for a manila envelope yellowed with age. "The night your parents died, Marcus," Margaret began, her eyes fixed on the table. There was another car involved, a car that left the scene. The silence stretched taut between them. Sarah watched Marcus's face drain of color, watched his jaw clench with the same determination she'd seen when he'd fought against the icy river current. "I was working the case," Margaret continued, "young detective, ambitious, hungry to prove myself. The physical evidence was minimal, a few paint chips, some tire tracks the snow had mostly obscured. But there was a witness." She pulled a faded photograph from the envelope. Sarah leaned forward and her world tilted. Staring back at her was her father's face, 20 years younger but unmistakably him. "Dad," Sarah breathed, her voice breaking on the single syllable. Margaret nodded grimly. Richard saw everything. The other driver running the red light, the impact, the moment they made the decision to flee. He called it in, gave his statement, identified the vehicle. Marcus's voice came out raw, strangled. "Then why?" "Because the driver was Senator Patricia Whitmore's son. 21 years old, drunk, and driving Daddy's campaign car 3 weeks before the election." Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. The pressure came from everywhere. The district attorney, the mayor, my captain. They said prosecuting would destroy an innocent family's future over an accident. Sarah felt the baby kick hard, as if protesting the injustice. "But my parents were dead," Marcus said, each word sharp as broken glass. "I know." Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "God help me, I know. I was told to lose the witness statement, to file the case as a simple accident. I was 28 years old and terrified of losing my career." The room felt airless. Sarah reached for Marcus's hand, finding it cold, and clenched into a fist. "What happened to my father?" Richard wouldn't let it go. He kept calling, demanding to know why no arrests had been made. The pressure from above got worse. Then one night, Richard called me. Margaret pulled out a cassette tape, ancient and worn. He said he'd been receiving threats. Someone had followed him home, left messages. He was scared, especially with you being so young, Sarah. Sarah's mind reeled. Fragments of childhood memories suddenly rearranged themselves. Her father's sudden paranoia, the way he'd started checking locks twice, his insistence on moving across town. "I made him a promise that night," Margaret whispered. "I told him that if he stopped pushing, stopped talking about the case, I would make sure justice came eventually. Someday, when I had the power to act without destroying my career, I would reopen the investigation." "But you never did," Marcus said, his voice hollow. Margaret shook her head. "Richard died 6 months later. Heart attack," the doctors said. "Stress-related. And you, Sarah, you were just a child who disappeared into the foster system. I tried to find you, but the records were sealed, families moved. By the time I had the rank and influence to really investigate, the trail had gone cold. Sarah felt like she was drowning again, but this time in the weight of decades-old lies and buried truths. The man who killed Marcus's parents, Tommy Whitmore, died in a skiing accident in Switzerland 4 years later, drunk again. Margaret's voice carried bitter satisfaction. Justice of a sort, but not the kind your parents deserved, Marcus. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window where snow fell in gentle flakes that seemed to mock the chaos inside. All these years you knew. When you took me in, when you helped me through school, when I became a paramedic, you knew someone had killed them and walked away. I thought I was protecting you from a truth that would only bring more pain. Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making every movement deliberate. The baby was moving constantly now, restless and urgent. The drowning, she said suddenly. Marcus ending up in that river at that exact moment when I was there. Some might call it fate, Margaret said quietly. 2 children whose lives were destroyed by the same moment, finding each other when they needed salvation most. The words hung in the air like a benediction and a curse combined. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in deceptive purity, while underneath, the truth finally surfaced after decades of being frozen in place. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window as Sarah adjusted the blanket around her sleeping daughter. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's birth. 3 weeks since the world had shifted on its axis and rearranged itself into something beautiful and strange. The baby stirred, her tiny fist curling against Sarah's chest, and Sarah marveled at how perfectly she fit there, as if this was always how it was meant to be. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Michael stood in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the same expression of quiet wonder that had rarely left his face since learning he was a grandfather. "How are my girls this morning?" he whispered, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Perfect," Sarah said, meaning it. "We're perfect." Michael reached out tentatively, and Sarah shifted so he could see Emma's face more clearly. The baby opened her eyes at that moment, blinking slowly in the filtered sunlight, and Michael's breath caught. "She has your mother's eyes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The same eyes I've been looking at in photographs for 20 years, wondering if I'd ever see them again in person." Sarah touched Emma's cheek gently. "Tell me about her, about my mother." Michael settled back, his gaze distant but warm. Rebecca had this way of seeing straight through to the heart of things. She could look at a person and know exactly what they needed to hear, what they needed to feel seen. "You have that same gift, Sarah. The way you saw through my anger that day by the river, the way you refused to let me drown in more than just that water." "I almost didn't jump in," Sarah admitted. "I was scared for the baby, scared of the current. But you did jump in. That's what matters. That's what Rebecca would have done too." Michael leaned forward, studying Emma's sleeping face. She would have loved being a grandmother. She always said she wanted a house full of children and grandchildren, wanted to be the kind of grandmother who had flour in her hair from baking cookies and grass stains on her knees from playing in the garden. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish she could have met Emma." "In a way she has." Michael's voice was soft but certain. "I see her in Emma's expressions, in the way you hold her, in the way this whole impossible story brought us together. Rebecca always believed that love finds a way, even across impossible distances." The door opened wider, and David appeared with a large bouquet of wildflowers and a shopping bag that appeared to be overflowing with baby clothes. Behind him came Detective Morrison, looking pleasantly out of place in the maternity ward. "Sorry to interrupt," David said, "but someone insisted on meeting the hero who solved his cold case." Detective Morrison approached with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said to Sarah, "and to meet the little one who's going to grow up knowing her grandfather because her mother had the courage to jump into a freezing river." Sarah shifted Emma so the detective could see her better. Any word on the investigation? Morrison nodded grimly. Charles Whitmore has been formally charged. The evidence from his office, combined with the documents Michael kept all these years, painted a pretty clear picture. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Good, Sarah said simply. She felt no satisfaction in another person's downfall, but justice for her mother's death brought a sense of completion she hadn't known she needed. There's something else, Morrison continued. The life insurance money that Whitmore collected? We've recovered most of it. Along with some accounts we found, there's quite a substantial sum that belongs to you now, Sarah. Your mother's family isn't just reunited. It's going to be financially secure. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. The money felt secondary to everything else they'd found, but Sarah couldn't deny the relief of knowing Emma's future would be stable. David moved closer, reaching out to stroke Emma's tiny hand with one finger. She's beautiful, Sarah. Absolutely perfect. She is, Sarah agreed, looking around the room at these men who had become her unexpected family. Michael, the father she'd never known, but who'd been searching for her as long as she'd been searching for him. David, whose quiet strength had anchored her through the chaos of discovery and birth. Detective Morrison, whose dedication to an old case had helped bring truth to light. And Emma, the newest member of this unlikely constellation, sleeping peacefully in the center of it all. You know, Michael said softly, I spent 20 years believing I'd failed Rebecca, that I hadn't protected her or been the husband she deserved. But looking at you, at Emma, at how you've built this life despite everything you didn't know about your past, I think Rebecca would say I helped raise a daughter after all. Through you, through the love she gave you before she died. Sarah felt the last piece of her heart's puzzle click into place. We found each other, Dad. That's what matters now. Outside, spring was painting the world in shades of hope and new beginnings.